So now, before we can start working on problems, we already did definitions, but we have to remember a couple of things about making actual calculations, because sometimes you guys just totally forget everything you learned in elementary school. So back in elementary school, you learned about this thing called PEMDAS. I hope you haven't forgotten about it, but if you have, we're going to write it down. PEMDAS is an abbreviation for the order of operations, and it stands for parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. You might have learned a fancy little saying to remember it, and that would be, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So if you have trouble remembering PEMDAS, you can remember the phrase, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Don't forget it. So now, why do we need that? PEMDAS is important because when you're doing these calculations, it's important to remember what you need to do first, especially if you're putting it into your calculator. So if you have something like this, I've seen students, I kid you not, square the 3 and then square the 5 and then add them. Don't do that. What we want to do first is inside the parentheses, because that's first. If we add what's inside the parentheses, we end up with 8. Then we get to our exponent and we square the 8 and we get 64. If we had done something where we squared the 3 and made it a 9, and then squared the 5 and made it a 25, we would add that together in 34 and we would be absolutely wrong. So the order of operations is really important for your questions. Another really important thing is how you type it into your calculator. So if you see this in a question, type it exactly that way. I know a lot of you have very fancy calculators, but even if you don't have a fancy calculator and you have one of those really basic ones, they all have parentheses on them. So if you have parentheses in the question, you have to type them into your calculator. Another thing that you want to remember about calculations is dividing by negatives. When you have a negative number divided by a negative number, it's always going to be positive. So if we have negative 24 divided by negative 3, negative divided by a negative is always positive. If you have a negative number divided by a positive number, or vice versa, a positive number divided by a negative number, it's going to always equal a negative. And when you type in a negative number in your calculator, you have to type it in with parentheses. So this in your calculator should be parentheses, negative 24, parentheses, the dividing sign, parentheses, negative 3, parentheses. If you get into the habit of using parentheses on all of your questions, you will never make a calculating mishap on your calculator. The other thing that you want to remember about negative numbers is squaring them. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen students get questions wrong because they don't use parentheses in their calculator when referring to negative numbers. So if we have negative 3 squared, if you see this on the test, you need to type it in your calculator with parentheses. If you had typed that into your calculator without parentheses, what it does is it says, because we have this order of operations, our exponent is first. So we square the 3 first and get 9, and then the calculator is thinking that it's 9 times negative 1, so it puts it as negative 9. But that's not what this is. Negative 3 squared is positive 9, because a negative times a negative is always going to be positive. So parentheses on your calculator is super important, because you might be on the hardest question ever, you might have done all this amazing work, and then you don't want to screw yourself over by forgetting to do something really simple like adding parentheses. Then, in terms of some other stuff that you want to be familiar with on your calculator, I'm not sure what kind of calculator you have, but if you happen to have a graphing calculator like a TI-83, TI-82, or TI-89 Plus, or whatever TI is coming out with these days, there are a couple of great functions that you should familiarize yourself with. The first thing is the mode. You need to make sure that you're not in radian mode. A lot of you are working in radians in your school math class, but the SAT does not deal with radians. So in class, you might be in radian mode and you might forget to change it back to degree mode. And then some of the calculations you make, especially those involving pi, might be a little funky. So before you go to your SAT on that Saturday morning, Friday night, just automatically put your calculator into degree mode so you have nothing to worry about that morning. The other thing that's going to be really helpful for you on the SAT, if you do have a graphing calculator, is the y equals function. The y equals function on your calculator is awesome because you can type in any equation and it will graph it for you, which is fantastic because not only can you solve a lot of these questions just by graphing it, but you can check your answer if you happen to be one of those people who prefers to solve things algebraically. So if you have a graphing calculator, learn the y equals function, familiarize yourself with it. All you have to do is type in the equation exactly as it's written on your test, hit the button graph, and boom, you have this fantastic picture that is going to illustrate exactly what you need to know for the question. Then, back to fractions. On your calculator, we have that whole parentheses talk with negatives. The parentheses are even more important with fractions than they are with negatives because when you type in a fraction on your calculator, you need to type it in as a parentheses fraction because otherwise the order of operations is going to get messed up. So 3 divided by 5 is how you need to type in 3/5, the fraction. If you want to get it as a decimal, all you do is hit enter. The other thing that you can do on a graphing calculator is if you have a decimal, what you can do in order to get what fraction it is you have your decimal, you hit the math button, and then under the math function, there's a thing that says frac, F-R-A-C. You hit enter when it says frac, and what that does is it converts the decimal into a fraction. So if you just want to know what fraction it is, that's the easy way of doing it on your calculator. The other thing that you want to remember is when you have a mixed number. So something like this. If you have 3 1/4, I can't tell you how many times someone thinks that they're doing the right thing by typing this in like this. The way that will work out on your calculator, if you type 3 parentheses 1/4 parentheses, that's saying that it's 3 times 1/4, which will result in 3/4. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking at 3 1/4. So this is not the way we type in mixed numbers. 3 1/4 is just another way of saying 3 + 1/4. So the correct way of typing in a mixed number on your calculator is 3 plus parentheses 1/4. And that will give you the appropriate number on your calculator. So don't lose points on these really, really basic calculation errors that you might do just because you're not taking the time to really use your calculator to its full abilities. So don't let your calculator hurt you, let it make your life easier, and take the time to really go through these things and make sure you're comfortable with that, because that's the last thing we need to lose 10 points on is because you forgot to put the parentheses in.